The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. The Constitution doesn't say anything about sex, though the Declaration of Independence promoted the pursuit of happiness. But for the past 100 years or so, courts have been in our bedrooms. Law professor Geoffrey Stone has the lowdown. 100 years after women won the right to vote, Professor Brooke Kroeger reveals the role that men, or suffragents, played in the movement. And commentator Alexi McCammond of Axios talks with Peter Ogburn on the Bill Press Show about the friction between Trump and Congress. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. For most of history, society had no problem with contraception, abortion, or obscenity, until state legislatures and courts became obsessed with sex. Professor Geoffrey Stone says it was because of the evangelical movement. And we say hello to Geoffrey R. Stone, is the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago and one of the nation's leading constitutional lawyers. He's written a provocative new book called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. Geoffrey Stone, thanks so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure. There is nothing in the Constitution about sex, specifically, correct?
Correct.
But it seems as if the nation's legislatures, Congress, and the courts are as obsessed by sex as your average teenager. Is there an easy answer as to why?
Well, the obsessed word is complicated. I guess I would say that, first of all, sex is a natural part of life, and it has long fascinated people from the very origins of Western culture. The Greeks and the Romans, for example, had very robust and open sexual lives. They had no concept of sexual sin or shame. The law did not interfere in any way, really, with the sexual freedom that existed then. And at various points in the history of Western culture, this has also been the case. On the other hand, particularly with the advent of Christianity over time, the religion took a more aggressively restraining position with respect to what was seen to be appropriate sexuality, to the point where under Augustine in the 5th century, the church basically endorsed the view that any sexual behavior is essentially immoral and sinful, and that the only time sex would be permissible was in the marriage relationship, only for the purpose of procreation, only the missionary position, and in which the husband and wife are not to take any carnal gratification from the act. So you have this long fascination with sexuality, both as a part of human happiness and as a part of what was perceived as fundamental human sin and shame. And they've wrestled with each other throughout Western culture and Western society. And so there's been this ongoing battle between those who want to impose their sense of religious values upon society, in part because of their belief that if society acts in ways that are not in conformity with those religious beliefs, that we will see another Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of society. And on the other hand, one finds people who say, look, that's not really sensible. We don't buy into that. We should be free to live our own lives. If you want to live your lives in accord with your religious faith, that's fine. That's your prerogative, but you shouldn't try to dictate that for us. And so that's been an ongoing battle throughout Western culture and throughout American history.
What is the actual history of abortion law in the United States? And would you say that the pro-life movement is largely based on opposition to unmarried women having sex?
Well, abortion was completely legal throughout Western history until the late 19th century in America. at least pre-quickening. That meant before the midpoint of pregnancy, roughly 4.5 months. The world in which the framers lived allowed abortion, and that was the case throughout the first half of the 19th century. And indeed, abortion was open, it was legal, it was openly advertised, and the number of abortions was extremely high. And as we moved through the 19th century, the abortion rate increased dramatically because in the 18th century, which was a primarily agrarian society, the average family had 9 children, and children were an economic asset in farm life. But as people moved into cities, large families were no longer an economic advantage. They were often destructive of the success of a family. And because contraception was still pretty rudimentary, the demand for abortion was quite high. And by the middle of the 19th century, one out of every 3 pregnancies ended in abortion legally. That didn't change until the late 19th century, when a movement arose, partly due to religion, partly due to some quack medicine, which took the view that, first of all, women did need to be controlled in their sexual desires. And if women could have sex following a kind of Eve-like behavior in fulfilling their carnal desires, and could do that without any consequence. In other words, if they got pregnant, they could just have an abortion, that would be bad and immoral. And therefore, one of the arguments against the continued legality of abortion was to restrain women in their sexuality. And the other was the notion that began to emerge that the fetus was a human person at the time of conception. And by the time that we got to the end of the 19th century, all abortion was illegal in the United States for the first time in Western history, unless a doctor determined that the abortion was necessary to save the life of the woman. And the problem is that did not stop the reality of women having unwanted pregnancies, and the number of unlawful abortions continued to grow through that period. And the difference was, instead of being able to have a legal abortion performed by a trained and experienced midwife in an open and appropriate manner, it all was driven underground. And women now, for the first time, were forced to self-abort using knitting needles and crochet hooks and scissors, or they were required to go to back alley abortion, where they would basically, in the sort of typical situation, find the name of someone who would perform an abortion. Maybe they'd get that name from an elevator operator or from a butcher, and they were told to stand at 1 a.m. on a street corner. Someone would come up to them from behind and blindfold them, throw them in the back seat of a car, drive them some unknown destination. While they still had the blindfold on, the abortion would be performed by people they couldn't see, didn't know who they were, and then eventually they'd be dropped off again in some unknown place, because it was all illegal. And in this world, the dangers caused by abortion were much greater, because they were being performed by people who were not trained, and you didn't even know who was doing it half the time. And so 200 women a year were dying from illegal abortions, and thousands more were suffering very serious injuries from botched abortions. And this was the world that we lived in going into the late 1960s. And part of the problem was that women who had abortions couldn't and didn't tell people about their experiences, because it was a crime and it was shameful and it was sinful. And so this was a dark world which was not well known by people. And it was only in the 1960s, during the women's movement, that women began encouraging other women to tell their stories and to talk about how this experience affected them. And that began the movement in the late 60s to legalize abortion. And that led ultimately in 1973 to the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade. And I should add, by the way, that I was a law clerk to Justice Brennan during that year. So I was at the Supreme Court at the time Roe v. Wade was decided.
And the pro-life movement, would you say it is based on opposition to unmarried women having sex?
I would say it's based primarily, initially, I think that was part of the reason, as I said earlier. Mm-hmm. Today, I think it is based almost entirely on the notion that the fetus is a human being and should be treated like a person, and therefore abortion is inappropriate and should be illegal because it's no different in the eyes of the people who oppose it than would be killing a 2-year-old child because you don't want it anymore. So I think that's now become the primary motivation for opposing abortion, less than controlling the sexuality of women. And part of the reason for that shift is that contraception is now legal. It's become much more effective, and women can, in fact, in general, have sex without so much of a risk of unwanted pregnancy, much more so than the past. Although it's still the case that 1 million women a year have illegal abortions today. That contraception is not perfect. Not everyone has access to it. And we still today live in a world in which 1 million women have legal abortions.
We're speaking with Geoffrey Stone, Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, and his latest book, Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. Geoffrey, we've heard from conservatives for so long about the courts attacking religion, but isn't there a reversal now to use the courts to protect the religious views of some people by actually denying equal rights to other people?
Well, yeah, one of the really interesting phenomena in all this is that for most of our history, people with strong religious beliefs have successfully attempted to redefine the law in such a way as to impose their religious beliefs on other Americans who don't share those beliefs. And on issues like obscenity, contraception, abortion, gay rights, and so on, religious forces have managed to basically criminalize behavior that Americans who don't share their beliefs think should be perfectly legal. And now we've seen, at least for the moment, an interesting shift in which, at least in part, those people with strong religious beliefs are saying, if we are going to have to live in a world in which we tolerate your immoral behavior, even though I think it should be criminalized, but you're going to be allowed to use contraception, to see obscenity, to have abortions, to have same-sex sex, to have same-sex marriage. At the very least then, the Constitution should protect me as a person who has strongly felt religious beliefs from being compelled to act in ways that are inconsistent with my strongly held religious beliefs. And frankly, I think that's a serious argument, and it's one that has to be taken seriously. There are limits, of course, on what you can do because you believe something to be your religious faith. But at the same time, I do think it's appropriate in a democracy for society to respect the religious rights of others. I don't believe those people with religious belief should be able to impose their views on others and control their freedom. But at the same time, I do think that society should respect the individual rights of people who hold strongly held religious beliefs and not compel them to act in ways that are inconsistent with those beliefs unless there's a strong reason for doing so. And the difficult question that we now face is, well, how strong is the state interest in requiring a baker to make a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding when the baker believes that that is sinful? Or to what extent should a company or should an individual employer be required to provide contraceptive insurance for employees when that employer believes that contraception is immoral? That's not, in my view, an easy question. And I think it's one that the courts will have to struggle with as we figure this out, and the legislatures will have to struggle with as we figure this out in the coming years.
Okay. Geoffrey Stone, Edward H. Levy, Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. We're talking about his new book today, Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. Geoffrey, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we do look forward to having you back again soon. My pleasure. Anytime I can help, feel free to call on me. Thanks very much. Take care. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Journalism professor Brooke Kroeger tells the story of how men helped the suffragist movement win the vote for women 100 years ago. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
While our present president's moral character seems stuck somewhere between boorish and brutish, it's only fair to note that he also has an aesthetic dimension. This surprising side of Trump popped out several days after the Charlottesville attacks by raging white supremacists. In a presidential tweet, he said, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart." Yes, very sad to see a resurfacing of raw bigotry ripping so viciously into America's historic attempts to create a culture of mutual respect and unity in a nation of extraordinary diversity. E pluribus unum, as our national maxim puts it. Oh, wait, that's not what Donald meant. Rather than criticizing those who are out to rip apart the American culture's big idea of egalitarianism, this was just more babble from the boorish Trump. He was actually advocating the continued presence of statues of Confederate champions of racism, pieces of bronze and granite that publicly celebrate America's shameful period of slavery, secession, and white supremacy. The KKK thugs invaded Charlottesville in violent objection to the city's planned removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, who led the Southern States War against the USA so they could keep enslaving African Americans. Trump's lament, then, was not about the attack on America's humanitarian ideals, but merely about, quote, the removal of our beautiful statues. Apparently, it never occurred to him that most Americans do not consider those statues either beautiful or ours. Ironically, Robert E. Lee himself opposed erecting Confederate statues across the South. Quote, "I think it wiser not to keep open the sores of war," he said, but instead to obliterate the marks of civil strife. This is Jim Hightower saying we could use a leader with such wisdom today when bigots feel newly empowered to incite civil strife across our nation.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. 100 years ago, it was the pillars of New York society, men of industry, law, and letters, who marched for and helped win women's right to vote. Professor Brooke Kroeger tells the story of the suffragents. And we say hello to Brooke Kroeger, former reporter, now a journalism professor at New York University. She's also the author of 5 books, and the latest of which is The Suffragents, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. Brooke Kroeger, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's nice to have you with us. You have uncovered an interesting footnote to history, and that is the role of men in publicly supporting the fight for women's suffrage. What was their motivation, and did they face any social or political risks?
Good question. Their motivation in many cases was a sense of a just cause that needed to be supported. Remember, these men were progressives regardless of their political party. Some were Republicans, Democrats, independents, socialists, but the common factor was they were progressives. And secondly, they were motivated by their wives, their mothers, their lovers, their sisters, the people that in their lives who represented the need for women's rights, or the women themselves were actually activists. And then, of course, in terms of the risks they faced political risks. There actually are examples, for instance, Dudley Field Malone, who was a great supporter of women's rights, who had one of the top patronage jobs of the Wilson administration in the ports of New York, and he gave it up because of Wilson's continued reluctance to give full-throated support to the cause. That's one. And then socially, one of the great stories that really is the one thing that stood out in the minds of all these hundreds of men was when they first marched in 1911, and this was true again in 1912, and then, to a lesser extent, and then less in 1913. By then it sort of became commonplace to have men marching for women as a battalion. But they were pelted, they were humiliated, where's your handkerchief, Lizzie? This sort of taunting. And these were financiers, clergy, really important men in New York society. So kind of imagine them in their top hats or their fedoras, in full suits, carrying a banner, walking down Fifth Avenue, and being pelted and catcalled and brickbatted. And to me, it was especially interesting that they never mentioned almost never mentioned the Men's League in memoirs or in their obituaries, but especially in the memoirs, over and over again, there is reference to this experience, which they undertook with grace. And if you think about the times and how defined men's and women's roles were in 1909, 1910, 1911, the fact that people of this sort of social position were willing to undertake that is pretty remarkable in itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But even the society women who had signed on to help at the same time were not willing to march. That they would not do. It was, really beneath their sense of dignity. But the men, they trooped right out there, right under the Union Club, right under the clubs to which they belonged, where their friends and colleagues and business associates were looking down in, aghast. Pretty good.
Yeah, very good and very commendable and pretty amazing, as you point out, when you think about the time.
Exactly.
You mentioned President Wilson a few moments ago, and I'd like it if you could touch on that a little bit. In what was his real role, because he's a so-called progressive, in getting the 19th Amendment passed?
So his role was important in the end because he really did write to various senators and congressmen and, really push the agenda. But that was a really long time coming. So from his time as governor of New Jersey and then during his first administration, he would use the states' rights dodge. Do you know that one? Where, it's simply this is a matter for the states to decide. It's not a federal issue. He would find 50 ways from Sunday to keep repeating that every time the question was put to him, and it was put to him frequently. He would find any way to skirt it simply by saying that. He did when New Jersey voted and when New York voted, make a statement in both cases, a public statement urging people to pass the amendment. That is as far as he would go. Until World War I, where the sacrifice of the women, not only their sacrifice in terms of their husbands, sons, and brothers, and fathers, I guess, in some cases, not only in those terms, but also in terms of the Herculean effort they put forward to support the war effort at home. Home and then also as nurses, I suppose, and everything else. But that became so profound that there simply was no way any longer to avoid the question. At the same time, a number of other states had passed the vote for women, like New York, for instance, in 1917. This anniversary is coming up on November 6th, 100 years. So there were actually more women in the voting public. So all those things rather came together, and Wilson finally really got on board, but at the very end.
It almost sounds like
crucial. It was important. It was definitely important.
But it almost sounds like he just acquiesced because of pressure as much as anything else. Or is that an unfair statement?
I wouldn't say pressure. I would say the zeitgeist. Its time had it became undeniable. It was like the little king principle. You stand up because you say to everyone, stand up because everybody's standing up. That
Sure.
sort of thing.
All right, now a couple of questions. I want to kind of switch it around a little bit and move on to your role as a journalism professor. What is the state of journalism today when everybody with a smartphone can pretend to be a journalist?
What do you think? I mean, look what's going on. Look at the renaissance of great journalism in our top mainstream newspapers, our legacy institutions. I can't think of a more exciting time. I mean, I don't have a real measure of how great things are, even while things are in states of transition. But I can tell you about interest in the program I teach, which has not, if anything, is more exuberant than ever. And the kinds of work that my students want to do and have signed up to do, and who they are even coming in the door, would make your heart swell as a journalist. It certainly makes mine.
It's refreshing.
Teach a program called Global and Joint Program Studies. It's a master's program. I don't mean to give a promo for it, but I think it's relevant to what you're asking. It's half in journalism and half in 7 or 8 different area studies programs, from Africana studies to Latin American studies, Near Eastern studies. These students come with language preparation, significant experience for their age and station in the regions in which they have interest, the regions or international relations. And they are coming to, as I like to tell them, slay dragons in the world. And there's no dip in that enrollment, even over this period since, let's say, 2006-07, when the world seemed to be on very, very shaky ground. I find it a very exciting time in journalism, and especially during this recent period of political intensity, to see the way that serious media has stood up to really trying to inform the public has been really gratifying. That's what I think, but I'm a glass half full kind of gal.
Well, I mean, look, the perception for a lot of people might actually be the opposite, where they don't think journalists are objective and fair anymore, that it's, the whole fake news thing and that sort of thing. And I think there are people that are concerned that perhaps journalism, the way that we always grew up with it, being fair and objective, is out the window. You're going to disagree with that, aren't you?
A little bit. I think that where the education has to happen is helping readers, users, discern real information from false information. And I think there are a lot of journalism literacy efforts out there to encourage that agenda, both in the schools and just in training, how you really learn to know the difference. And then, of course, the word objective, also gets distorted. I mean, nobody's objective. I've certainly heard my colleague Jay Rosen talk about the view from nowhere. Nobody has a view from nowhere. But adhering, as Walter Lippmann, a member of the Men's League, would have told you in 1920, it's about putting a rigor on the way you present, collect, and present information so that it's very clear what its origins are, how much credence you can give it. I mean, those would be the important values, if you ask me.
Journalism is not dead, then?
Not dead.
Excellent.
Not dead.
That's
Definitely
what I wanted to hear. Brooke Kroeger, journalism professor at New York University, author of 5 books. The latest, The Suffragents, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. Brooke, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
You're so welcome, and thank you for asking me.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, guest host Peter Ogburn talks with commentator Alexi McCammond on The Bill Press Show.
We're talking about the Phoenix rally earlier because I haven't had a chance to talk about it. I know you guys talked about it a little bit yesterday. But how, like, I didn't see it live. I want to be, but I watched it later on in the evening. But I did look at Twitter, and everybody was completely losing their mind. Like, he's unhinged. This is terrible. He's like, this is the worst one we've seen in a while. Yeah. And I don't disagree with that. But like, in a lot of ways, this was not like shocking to me. Like, this was Trump.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what I struggle with. People always say, like, if you're shocked, you haven't been paying attention.
Right.
And I agree with that to an extent, though I do think it's important to, like, for me to continue being critical, but it felt different this time.
Yeah,
I watched it live, and it was, I was tired. It ended at like 11:30, but it felt different. I think because the past 2 weeks were filled with all of the tension and drama and controversy from Charlottesville and Boston, and it had been 2 weeks of Trump handling these things in sort of egregious, inappropriate ways, whether it's his remarks or otherwise. And so this gave him an opportunity to right his wrong, so to speak. And that's what he attempted to do through revisionist Charlottesville history. And he failed.
This to me was a throwback to campaign Trump.
It was.
In a big, big way, which, by the way, this was a campaign rally. This was a campaign event for his 2020 re-election bid.
Was it technically?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
That's what it was.
It was organized by the campaign.
It was organized, by the campaign to re-elect him in 2020, which is weird.
Why is it starting so early?
It's just weird. I mean, it's a totally different thing. I've never seen.
But this isn't the first one, right?
No, they did something like this before.
Right.
It was a southern state on the East Coast. I forget what it was. But
I do too. But
it's already started.
It's already started.
Right.
I mean, John Delaney's running for president, ladies and gentlemen.
We're in the middle of the race for 2020, y'all, whether you know it or not. But so, like, I'm not of a mind that this was any more unhinged than Trump usually is. It's just been a while since we've seen this.
Yeah.
And I think it was just kind of like the perfect storm of he's been getting a lot of criticism over the last week. I think that by all reporting, John Kelly and other people are working really, really hard to keep him on message and to keep him from going completely off the rails.
Right.
And he just needed that outlet.
He did. He didn't really follow the teleprompter at all, which is not surprising. And I think this was just a reflection of the fact that Trump will always be Trump and John Kelly can't really control him. I think there was a moment during his speech when he mentioned John Kelly, but like John Kelly was nowhere to be found. Like, I don't even know if he was there. So even if he was, Trump would have been the same Trump he was.
I like to think of Trump referring to John Kelly and then saying, bless his heart. Like, after talking, like, John Kelly, bless his heart. He's trying.
Right, but I'm not listening.
But I'm not listening.
Or someone like Hope Hicks saying that, who has been there the whole campaign, the whole time. And
she knows who he is.
Looking at John Kelly, bless his heart.
Bless his
We
heart.
tried, he's trying. No one's going to be able to fix this man.
It's just never going to happen.
Right.
And so that puts us in this, like, really interesting dynamic of how the hell do Republicans work with him. And so, like, we've been in this weird period, right, of focusing so much on Trump care for the last couple of months. And now we're at a point where, like, okay, they're going to have to move on to something else, but can they get anything done?
That's
yes or no?
so hard.
I'm
right.
kidding.
I don't know. I mean, obviously, we've been hearing they're pivoting to tax reform. I think what's going to be interesting come September is seeing this slew of Republicans who are distancing themselves from Trump, especially after Charlottesville, questioning his, like, moral stability and his competence. But then, like, they want to get tax reform done. Their constituents want them to get tax reform done. So how do they reconcile that? Do they continue distancing themselves and not support legislation put forward by a president with whom they morally disagree? Or do they go with the party and push forward on these policies that are put forward by Trump, even though they're unhappy with him.
Trump, I think, is kind of getting hoisted on by his own petard here because, like, his skill, I think, is creating his own narrative, right? Like, he can talk about whatever he wants to talk about.
Right.
And, like, you just can't do that if you want to be president.
Right. Well, also, I think that's his downfall come September, pushing forward on these things, because I heard from a source the other day, he was telling me that people who work with McConnell and who have worked with McConnell want Trump to have nothing to do with tax reform because they're already worried that he's going to screw up the messaging and prevent it from having any chances of getting passed.
You know, at the rally, you write about this in your piece at Axios.com. About tax reform, Trump promised to pass the first major tax reform in over 30 years. And he said if congressional Democrats don't support him in this legislation, they'll be, quote, stopping you from getting a massive tax cut. So right there, like, he's owning the fact that these are tax cuts.
Right.
This is not tax reform the way that Paul Ryan and everybody else has carefully molded this into being, you know, a carefully packed, which, like, they should just give up on that to begin with. Nuance is not his thing.
Right.
And he just goes right out and calls it tax cuts, which sort of shoots holes in the bucket of what they're trying to sell.
Luckily, I think for congressional Republicans, if I remember correctly, I think Trump said 10 words on tax reform during this
They're the only 10
speech.
words he knows about tax reform.
Right. So it's like he said only 10 words, so hopefully the crowd, amid, you know, railing against the media, just didn't even pay attention to that for congressional Republicans to worry about. But I mean, he doesn't know, and people are already worried about his messaging. And so if he steps in, which I think is especially, it's like, I was speaking with Chairman Dave Camp, who, you know, was the last person to try to rewrite the tax code in 2014. And he was like, if the president doesn't get behind this and isn't the one out there selling it, it's not going to pass. And then I hear from this source last week that people close to McConnell don't even want Trump to have anything to do with it. So it's like, what is he going to do?
What's going on with Trump and McConnell? Like, you know what I thought was just insane was he's out there ripping him on Twitter, and then McConnell's wife
that was so awkward.
Had to stand next to Trump while he launched into the Charlottesville, the now infamous Charlottesville comment.
I know.
And hold that long as hell ledger that dropped.
They rolled
to the
out
floor.
that giant scroll.
The flow chart.
The flow chart.
It was a flow chart.
A flow chart.
He offered to give it to the reporters. I would have taken it probably. Had I been there, I would have taken it.
It was
souvenir.
4 feet long. I mean, it was a long piece of paper. But Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, had to stand there next to Trump while he went on and on and on about this.
That's so weird to me. And
I think it's weird. I also think that it's demoralizing if you're Mitch McConnell.
But also what was interesting about that, and it would have been bigger news had Trump not made that press conference what it was her comment, Elaine Chao's comment. Someone said something to her about, you know, this weird feud with McConnell and Trump's her boss, and she was like, I stand by my man, both of them. And I was like,
wow.
Wait, what?
Are the far right is starting to call Mitch McConnell a cuck yet? Because I think he has officially earned that title.
Total cuck.
President Trump.
Total cuck.
President Trump.
Total cuck. So, like, where are they now? Where's McConnell and Trump now?
Well, there was a Washington Post report about that phone call in which Trump started berating him and shouting at him. I think it's clear that McConnell perhaps doesn't take Trump seriously or doesn't want to after seeing the way in which he treats him and other congressional Republicans. I don't think they're ever going to get along, especially after the way that Trump brought McConnell into that Twitter feud or one-sided Twitter feud. But they need to work together, right? Like, McConnell is Trump's hope of getting things passed. He is the reason that Gorsuch was confirmed.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of the only major relative wins Trump has had so far in his young presidency, and that's because of McConnell. And he's seemingly forgetting about that or doesn't even care when he's attacking McConnell to think, like, if it weren't for this guy, I wouldn't have this one thing that I can say, look at what I've done.
But I don't think Trump realizes that, and he's never going to recognize that. Trump is in it for Trump, and he's not going to give credit to anybody else.
Right.
And that's just that.
Right. Well, and especially after healthcare failed, it's easy to push the blame on McConnell, and that's exactly what he did, is absolving himself of the blame, pushing it on Congress, which is, you know, his base supporters across the country are super unhappy with Congress. So that blame shifting to Congress reflects his base, which he loves catering to. But it's just unwise. I mean, I'm not president, but I would say it's unwise to be attacking someone like McConnell, who is the reason you get things done, or the person through which you get things done.
Like, I will say that Barack Obama, when he was president, I think the knock on him was that he's inexperienced. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? Like when he first came in.
Right.
But to Obama's credit, he learned a lot. I mean,
right.
Let's call it a crash course on how to be president. But like, there are things you do and you cannot do, or you should do and should not do, or can do and cannot do. And he sort of was open to that. Trump is Trump. There's no changing him. He's going to run the country exactly how he thinks he should do it. And if that means laying waste to anybody that gets in his way, whether it's, Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan or, whoever, he'll do it. And he's going to shoot himself in the foot.
Yeah, he is.
A lot. Like a lot.
Right. And I think you make a great point that we've seen, whether it's James Comey or Steve Bannon or Reince Priebus or McConnell, that everyone is expendable to Trump. And no one can surpass him or have the spotlight more than him or assume positions of power in a way that is threatening to him. And if they do, he'll go after them. And it's just politically unwise because the presidency, sure, there's only one president, but you can't get things done by yourself. And he's not going to get anything done by alienating himself from everyone.
So I forget who it was, but somebody made a really good comment after Trump won the election early on. And said, we're about to find out just how much power the United States president has on their own.
Yeah.
And we're finding out that, like, not as much as you might think. I mean, look, he's gotten plenty of things done through executive order and things like that. But, like, Trump care couldn't get it done. Right. They're walking into this tax reform fight, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And he doesn't really have a whole lot of allies right now, and he's pissing off the most powerful people that could help him.
Right.
So, yeah, we are going to find out just how much power the United States president has on their own.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Geoffrey Stone, Brooke Kroeger, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.